Welcome to the Futból Pod. My name is Konstantin Eckner.
And my name is Abel Mesarros. We're glad you've decided to check out our new podcast. But before we dive right into our first show, we should address a few things. We're two football journalists that hope you share our love for the game and football analysis. While there are many great shows out there already, we believe there's room for one more. That's why we've launched the Futból Pod to bring you some of the most interesting people in the sport, people who shape the landscape of football on or off the pitch.
We sincerely hope you like what you hear and enjoy the discussions. For now, you can find our show on soundcloud.com/thefutbolpod and on YouTube. Just search for The Futból Pod. Very soon you will also be available on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, and Google Podcast. So make sure to subscribe wherever you like. If you want to support us, please visit patreon.com/thefutbolpod. Now, our first guest is none other than Grant Wahl, US soccer journalist who spent over 2 decades at Sports Illustrated. So let's not wait any longer. We give you Grant Wahl. Yeah, Grant, thanks for joining. A lot of people know you from your time at Sports Illustrated. I think you're over 2 decades there. But could you keep us and our listeners give an update on what you're up to now?
Yeah, first, thanks for having me on your show. I'm pretty busy these days. I have a twice weekly podcast called Futból with Grant Wahl, where I interview some of the most prominent figures in the sport, both in the United States, but also outside the United States, including Europe. So those are usually interviews, 20, 30 minutes. I try and have about half of them be Americans, men's and women's, and then half be global. So we've had Jurgen Klopp, Lothar Matthäus, Roberto Martinez, Henrik Mkhitaryan, an interesting group. And I really enjoyed doing those types of interviews because they're not soundbite interviews. You can get into really, long discussions, which I enjoy. And then I have a podcast series coming out on November 17th. It launches, and it's about the career of Freddie Adu. And it's going to be 7 episodes. And I covered Freddie Adu back in 2003 and 2004 when he was one of the biggest young emerging players in the world at the time. And people thought he could be the first superstar American men's soccer player. And he became, at 14 years old, the highest paid player in MLS. And he didn't make it. And so this podcast series is interviewing Freddie Adu, but also about 24 other people to tell the story of what happened. And also to sort of look at this idea, our obsession as a culture with young sports genius and at least the potential for that. I had also done our first stories on LeBron James for Sports Illustrated when he was 17 years old, a year before I was writing about Freddie Adu. So this has been a really fun project for me to do.
I remember reading those, I was there for the Freddie Adu part, and I remember actually reading the LeBron one. So I can't wait to check that out because it's gonna. Somebody needs to tell those stories, and you're obviously the best person to do it. So I'll be really looking forward to it, and already subscribing to the Futból Pod with you. So hopefully this is going to be tremendous as well.
I think also what is interesting about Freddie Adu is that now when you have these Martin Oedegaards and maybe now Youssoufa Moukoko at Borussia Dortmund, these young guys who are coming up when they are 15 or 16 and when they are really hyped, some people who are pessimistic or, want to put on the brakes a little bit, they then bring up Freddie Adu as an example because they say, look at what happened to Freddie Adu and the hype he had when he was 14. And then what happened to him. So, be patient and be cautious when you make these predictions about how their careers will go. So I think it's great to tell the story about Freddie Adu, actually.
I think so. And also I had questions in this podcast series for myself as a journalist. Did I do too much to make Freddie Adu sound like he was going to be more successful than he ended up being. But I also get a lot of credit still for writing our first LeBron James cover story when he was 17, and he made it. So like the idea of some phenoms are going to make it, some won't. And I'm really fascinated by the factors that go into determining who makes it and who doesn't.
Yeah, absolutely. The reason we invited you is because of your knowledge about US soccer, US football, and especially we wanted to talk to you about a very particular subject, and that's the Americans that played in Germany, in the German Bundesliga and in German football in general. And I myself, I remember when I was really young, watching the Bundesliga around 2000, 2002, around that time. And when there was a substantial number of Americans playing in the Bundesliga. I remember Clint Mathis with the Mohawk, kind of. I remember him especially because of the Mohawk, because I asked my parents to get one. They said no, surprisingly, I guess. But I remember him playing for Hannover, and Steven Gerundolo, Landon Donovan, Craig Berhalter. So there was a number of Americans there, and of course we have also a number of Americans today, and I think there's a certain connection between the two countries. And Abel and myself, we are covering the Bundesliga a lot for various outlets, so I think that's why we also wanted to invite you to talk about the Americans in the Bundesliga. And I mean, because before we maybe talk about the current situation and the talents that are now in Germany, you've been covering US soccer for a long time, and what do you remember about like the period around 2000, maybe afterwards, about the Americans playing in the Bundesliga, and especially because there were a few that did quite well for themselves. I think Craig Berhalter, for instance, at Energie Cottbus, but there were also a lot of players that failed and then maybe returned to the US. Or failed is a hard word, but they didn't achieve what they wanted to achieve. So what do you remember about that time and about the Americans here in Germany and Central Europe?
At that time, you still had a lot of even the top American soccer players went to college, university in the United States. And so they were moving at a later age to Germany than we see today, because today the best young American players don't go to college and play in that system anymore. So a lot of guys like Clint Mathis, they went to college for several years, then they started in MLS. And if they did well, like Clint Mathis did in MLS, then came the possibility of going to the Bundesliga. But you were still going over, I don't know the exact age that Mathis went, but he was, I'm sure, in his 20s. And, some players like Mathis, I thought a very talented player, obviously, but he didn't stick very long. And I noticed early on that he didn't really try to learn the language of German. And that to me has always been an indicator of how much success in the long term someone might have in Germany in terms of how many years did they stay there. And Clint Mathis didn't stay that long. Steve Cherundolo, on the other hand, he went to college for a couple years, but not all 4 years at Portland. And then basically was at Hanover his entire playing career. And early on, you could see that things were going well for him on the field. He was earning playing time, but he also learned the language. He was fluent very quickly and became just a part of the Hanover community. And I was always really impressed by Cherundolo and how he was able to do that. And then there were, some guys in between. Greg Berhalter had a few decent years, had some longevity there. And Landon Donovan was sort of the new type of player, American player, in the sense that he didn't go to college. So he was still in his teens when he went to Germany. And it was pretty apparent early on that Landon Donovan just prioritized lifestyle maybe more than other players over maybe the soccer itself. because he clearly had more talent than the other Americans, and yet he wasn't happy at Leverkusen, and fairly quickly pushed to go back to the United States. And in the end, Landon Donovan had a very productive career in MLS, a very productive career for the U.S. men's national team. But he went back briefly to Leverkusen, wanted to get out, and then he ended up having a couple of loans at Everton. But other than that, played his club football. I guess he had a loan at Bayern briefly under Klinsmann. But he just didn't. It didn't work for him in Europe, and I think that had a pretty big influence on a number of young Americans who decided to stay in MLS, as Donovan did. And it's just interesting for me to compare that to, say, many years down the road with Christian Pulisic having a similar influence, I've been told, by today's young Americans, and that they want to be like Christian Pulisic and go to Germany to start out.
Yeah, I mean, that's actually like a really good point, because I was kind of thinking about this preparing for the show about the incentives, and obviously that the context of these American players to come to Germany, it's just totally changed. And like you mentioned, this is like early 2000s. The MLS is only like 6 or 7 years old. I mean, these players, just even on my own like very limited playing career, I met a lot of these guys who are like 24 and they're coming out of college and then they're thinking of going pro. And now I think in 2020 that just looks like it's like from 400 years ago, like it just seems so outdated. But that was the norm, right? Because you didn't have like those academies then, or you just had a couple of them starting out, but it was a whole different pathway. So, but what was the incentive, you think, for these players like Mathis or Frankie Hayduk or Donovan? Like, was it always the same, or was it different on an individual basis? And like, how did they kind of achieve those, or they didn't?
Well, it just depended on the situation. For a lot of these guys, their salaries in MLS were much lower than the salaries they would make in Germany. MLS, especially back then, just didn't pay very much. And so it was certainly an opportunity for young Americans to get professional experience, but it was done on such a tight budget. And so guys wanted to, sometimes it was about money. Sometimes it was also about just wanting to play in one of the top European leagues. And it was hard. It seemed a bit harder at the time, even to get a work permit for England. And so, I can remember in the late 90s, Brad Friedel was wanted by Liverpool, and he was having all sorts of trouble getting a work permit, even though he played for the national team. And so I do think in those days, Germany became maybe a slightly preferred target because you didn't have to deal with the work permit issues as much. And so we saw some of that, but it's still like what was happening with Americans in Germany then is not like what we're seeing now with Americans coming over at a younger age, making a bigger impact. And it was sort of case by case basis back in the early 2000s.
I mean, one reason we also wanted to talk about Americans specifically in the Bundesliga in Germany is because of the relationship between the two countries. There's a very special relationship developing after World War II. Germans have always, West Germans after World War II, they have looked towards the United States and what's going on there. But also on the other hand, you had a lot of Americans being servicemen in Germany. And also you got the Landon Donovans and Craig Berhalters who moved over from the States and came to Germany and signed with Bundesliga clubs. But you also have basically a group of players who are the sons of servicemen that have been stationed, or that were stationed in Germany for a while. Fabian Johnson and Timothy Chandler, John Anthony Brooks. And I was wondering these guys usually played for the U.S. national team, but how were they viewed? How were they perceived in the United States? Because they were born in Germany usually, and I mean, it's I guess a different group of players in a sense. How are they perceived over in the U.S.?
I think the World Cup team for the United States in 2014 had the greatest number of German American players that we've seen. So you mentioned Fabian Johnson, John Brooks, Jermaine Jones, just a number of Julian Green, a number of those players. And I remember writing stories for the magazine about that trend. And also at that time, you had Jurgen Klinsmann as the U.S. coach, who I think exerted a lot of influence to get those players on the U.S. team. So in terms of how they were received, I mean, Jermaine Jones had a terrific World Cup in 2014, scored a fantastic goal against Portugal in a game that finished in a 2-2 tie. And I think Jermaine Jones became a star. And I don't think there was a resistance in the American public to the fact that he was German American or born and raised in Germany. From what I understand, over the years, there was some friction between the German American players on the U.S. team and the non-hyphenated Americans on the team. That came out more a little bit later. There was at least a feeling among some of the U.S.-born American players that the German Americans didn't feel like they were American enough, which gets into a really complicated discussion of what it means to be American or German or whatever. But it is true that after Klinsmann left, we don't see quite as many hyphenated Americans, though we still do on the national team. I mean, John Brooks is still a part of it. Serginho Dest is Dutch American. He announced a year ago that he was going to play for the U.S. instead of the Netherlands. And we run into that a lot in the U.S. with a lot of dual and triple nationals who can make a decision about which country they want to play for.
Yeah, speaking as somebody who's a sort of hyphenated American, so it's kind of an interesting thing. But this exists everywhere, right? Like I think the national teams are I think a great example of what identity is in the 21st century and how we think of them. But I mean, in terms of Germany, there's also a very rich history in the U.S. with German Americans. Even just soccer teams, there's like German American kickers. There's all these, St. Louis. There's a lot of these hotspots in the Midwest, or even like, New York area as well, which have a lot of German Americans, or even German. So I think that probably also played some factor into it. And like I mentioned, as you said, about Klinsmann, which was, I think people who followed the Bundesliga recently have gotten their own updated Jurgen Klinsmann experience. And I think that was much like the Americans, like they kind of, the veil has been lifted, or they were kind of, they got a taste of maybe something that they might not have wanted. But the question I wanted to ask you is kind of turning towards the more recent examples and this sort of newer age talents and the shifting of incentives to these players. Like, at the beginning of the conversation, you mentioned that, a lot of these players like Clint Mathis or whatever went to college and then became professionals. Now you see, the Christian Pulisics or the Weston McKennies or even like the Chris Richards, they will come over when they're, 17 or 19. What do you think? What is like? What's the incentive there? Is it just different changes in how people are becoming professionals, or like what? Can you give us like a little background on that?
It really has changed the role of college soccer in the development of the best young Americans, because the best ones just don't go, and it's more like the situation is around the world in terms of if you're 15 or 16 years old, and you're one of the top American players, you're already thinking about going to Germany or playing for an MLS team until you're 18. And we've seen examples now of, Christian Pulisic is the most prominent one, where he was able to get an EU passport, a Croatian passport, and go to Germany long before he turned 18 and play. And Dortmund gave him a great opportunity because they're really good at developing young talent, but also giving opportunities to play on their first team to that young talent. We're seeing something similar now with Gio Reyna, who got an EU passport thanks to his grandmother and was able to start at an earlier age at Dortmund. Now things are going very well for him. So there's some of that, but then you've got Weston McKennie, who didn't have an EU passport, so he had to wait until he was 18 to go to Germany, but was identified by Schalke after he had spent time in the FC Dallas development system. And, I think some of these guys have told me that they saw what Christian Pulisic did and they wanted to do that. And also you have other forces at work. 10 years ago, the vast majority of the best young American players were going to England and not to Germany. And now Germany has totally taken over England as the place where the best young Americans go. And that's for a few reasons. One is the work permit situation has always been difficult in England for Americans. But even more important, I think, is that Germany, the Bundesliga, gives more playing opportunities to younger players now. And the English Premier League, it's hard to get opportunities if you're a young player to play. And so that's why we even see young English players like Sancho going to Dortmund to get his opportunity, because he wasn't going to get that at Manchester City. So that's, I think, a big part of it, that young players get an opportunity in Germany. And, we've seen now Pulisic, Tyler Adams, Josh Sargent to an extent. And the language barrier doesn't seem to be a very big barrier at this point.
Yeah, absolutely. I think also Germans and the German Bundesliga has adjusted in a way that a lot of people speak English, more properly. And even there is like a cultural change in Germany you see, and especially in the urban areas. One thing I wanted to ask you, and some of the American listeners maybe will roll their eyes a little bit because they know it, but I think a lot of Europeans don't know it. When I do research on like Pulisic or Josh Sargent, I sometimes stumble upon the names of the teams they played before they came to Germany. Because like Pulisic was Pennsylvania Classics, or just Josh Sargent.
Mm-hmm.
I just quote what's written on transfermarket.com or so. St. Louis, Scott Gallagher, Missouri. It's like what's written there. So these are not the names of the MLS teams. Could you explain how the youth system and the academy system nowadays works in the US? And are these like basically the youth teams of MLS teams, or is there a different kind of system in place compared to Europe?
Yeah, the history of American soccer goes, long before MLS started, and there has been a club system where Scott Gallagher is one of the most traditional clubs in the United States, and it's in the St. Louis area. St. Louis is one of the most historical soccer cities in the United States. The 1950 U.S. World Cup team, half of its players came from St. Louis. And so that system of clubs, whether it's Pennsylvania Classics as part of that, where Christian Pulisic played, that system of clubs has been in place for a really long time. So far longer than the 25-year history of MLS. But what has happened is all of the MLS clubs have their own development systems now, development academies. And some MLS clubs invest more than others in those academies. That's why you see a lot of New York Red Bulls Academy products doing well, FC Dallas with like Weston McKennie and Chris Richards, But not every MLS team has devoted a lot of resources to their academies. So the club system still remains, and then the MLS academies have become their own clubs inside that system. And we've seen some change over time with that, because a few years ago, the U.S. Soccer Federation actually started something called its U.S. Development Academy, which included the MLS academies, but also all of the big clubs around the United States, sort of in its own league in a sense. And that changed during the pandemic. U.S. Soccer dropped the Development Academy, said they weren't going to fund it anymore. And now MLS has taken that over and started their own version of it. But that still also includes the traditional historical clubs in addition to the MLS Development Academies.
Yeah, I mean, like that part is super interesting because, like, you know, my time being in the US and like actually coaching in some of the youth setups was much like, as you mentioned, those kind of clubs. Like, I mean, I remember like some of the guys that I used to coach with, they played with a club team which had Giuseppe Rossi, who, you know, obviously had a pretty interesting career, maybe also worthy of a documentary at some point. If you're looking for new advice, but I think what's interesting is that, you know, so much of this is only known if you are in the U.S. but outside of the U.S. you just, you know, if you're just looking at it from like a German perspective or just somebody from the Bundesliga, you just look at these names and it's like they don't really like, maybe they'll know some of the MLS teams, but what I think is interesting is, how do you scout for those? Like if you're one of these European clubs, I mean, I would imagine it would be really, really scout some of these levels. Or do you just scout the international tournaments, or maybe you'll see them in like sort of the big sort of under 17 or under 15, or you just look at the national teams, or even just, you know, look at under 17 World Cup or something, or like these sort of premier cups that they'll have. Like, can you maybe shed some light on how you think you can scout some of these players, or is there any like examples of say like clubs like finding these people, or these Pulisics and McKennies and whatnot?
I mean, I spent time with the people at Dortmund, for example, and it was pretty similar how they started scouting Pulisic and Gio Reyna, and that was by sending scouts to tournaments in Europe where the U.S. under 17 team was playing. And that was a similar type situation for those two players with Dortmund. But we are starting to see other pathways scouting wise happen. So Bayern Munich with Chris Richards, Bayern started an actual partnership with FC Dallas, and there were Bayern scouts in Dallas looking at the FC Dallas development players, and they identified Chris Richards and ended up buying him. And so that type of scouting is happening as well. So I think we are starting to see more German clubs, more European clubs coming to the United States to scout. So going to tournaments, whether it's, the Development Academy or the, this MLS organized academy system. We're starting to see European clubs establish their own club development systems in the United States. And I think that hasn't produced that many players yet. But it's interesting. Like right now, the New York Red Bulls have a 17-year-old named Caden Clark who has gotten off to a really good start just the last month with the first team. And he has this sort of interesting pathway. He was with a club in the U.S. that FC Barcelona was connected to, but he's from Minnesota, but somehow his homegrown rights weren't with the MLS club in Minnesota. Like they ended up with the New York Red Bulls. And now part of his contract states that RB Leipzig will sort of be the club that gets him if he continues to show as well as he has for the New York Red Bulls. So I don't know what happened with his connection to Barcelona, but like it was interesting to see the Barcelona main Twitter account putting something out about Caden Clark recently, when it's not like he's going to Barcelona right now. If he's going to go anywhere in the next couple of years, it's going to be Leipzig.
Yeah, I mean, I think like that part is. I mean, I remember seeing the goal that he scored, which was like the solo run, which was superb. Yeah, maybe the Barcelona thing had to do with Serginho Dest now. It's just kind of marketing, because I think there is a perception from Europe of the US as this huge marketing opportunity, and obviously we know that the Bundesliga and the DFL has been exploring, and I mean, Bayern have had an office, and I got a chance to visit that office in New York City, and so that's always been there, and it's kind of difficult to judge if you are just watching from Europe, just to see like how much of this is for marketing and how much of this for real talent. But I think on the field, it's hard to question that there's been just this amazing American talent in the Bundesliga and in Europe as well. But can you maybe talk a little bit about? I mean, I know you touched on this earlier about the perception of the Pulisic and Weston McKennie's success, and maybe now Gio Reyna's success, and whether that's like altered the perception, or whether that's like done much for the Bundesliga, because there is still sort of a popularity issue there, or maybe that's changed, and maybe you can talk on that.
I mean, it is interesting. Clearly, the top clubs in Europe and the leagues want to be bigger in the United States, and that's why they've set up these offices in the US. It's why it's much easier to see games from Europe on American television now, in a way that wasn't possible 15 years ago. But I still don't think a top club is going to sign an American player unless they think he's good enough to play there. I haven't seen any real examples yet where, like, maybe we saw a little bit with like Nakata and some of the Italian clubs he signed with, where I think that was so transparent at times that it was a marketing ploy that I looked at as a different thing. I was surprised when Christian Pulisic was sold to Chelsea for $72 million that there was a lot of skepticism in England in particular that Pulisic, this was a marketing thing for him. Yeah. And I thought it was strange that he had to sort of prove himself even to his coach, Frank Lampard, last season. Now, obviously, Pulisic has some injury issues that are pretty regular, but when he's been healthy, he's been quite influential for Chelsea. There's a reason he has the number 10 shirt this year. Serginho Dest signs at age 19 with Barcelona, first U.S. national team player to do that. I don't think that was some marketing thing that Barcelona was doing. I think also, too, when you see Gio Reyna start a Champions League game and combine with Erling Haaland for a great goal, like you see that, and you see here's an American 17-year-old doing that, and it's hard to question that. I mean, he's just really good. So I think we are starting to see American development of soccer players get much better, to the point where, like Gio Reyna spent a couple years with NYCFC's youth system. Tyler Adams was with the New York Red Bull system for several years before he went to Leipzig. Even Pulisic had some time with the Philadelphia Union Academy before he went to Dortmund. So I think it's all part of a process that has been happening now for a few years. So like, I don't think I have people asking like, when they see Weston McKennie go to Juventus and Pulisic at Chelsea and Reyna at Dortmund and Adams at Leipzig and Dest at Barcelona, these are some of the top clubs in Europe. I don't think that happened overnight. There was a long process that led up to it.
Yeah, and maybe coming to the current situation, because we have now talked about Pulisic and McKennie, players that have left the Bundesliga. I mean, McKennie is only on a loan deal at Juventus, but there is the feeling that he will stay there or move elsewhere, and he will not come back to Schalke, also for financial reasons. And but speaking about the players that are now in the Bundesliga, and I mean, you named Gio Reyna, who's kind of the star of that group, and Tyler Adams maybe, but there are also some players who are trying to break through, I think. And there's one is Josh Sargent at Werder Bremen, and maybe Chris Richards at Bayern. And I mean, it's probably comparatively more or harder for Chris Richards to get playing time at Bayern, of course, but especially Josh Sargent, I think, is an interesting example, because Werder Bremen, they have been very careful with him and how they try to build him up and make him a starting center forward for them. What is your take on someone like Josh Sargent? Is he like what's in your opinion his upside, and do you think he's someone who could be a star player at a club like Bremen, or even move onto an even bigger club than Bremen, because Bremen have been for a couple of years now more mid-table region or even relegation battles, so it's not like they will play in the Champions League anytime soon.
Yeah, I mean, I got to admit, when I see Werder Bremen play, and this included last season, but also so far this season, it's not great soccer, and so you're hoping that Sargent will just get chances to score goals, and obviously it's on him to some extent to create that. But I know it has to be frustrating at times for him, and so if you're Gio Reyna at Dortmund, which has this amazing attack and wins games, that's a much different situation to be in. So I kind of hope that Sargent isn't at Werder Bremen for very long, because I don't suddenly see them starting to completely change as a team. But I could see him going any number of directions. There's a lot of people here in the U.S. who think Josh Sargent could and should be the starting center forward at some point for the national team. And he hasn't done enough yet to, I think, deserve that right now. But I think people think he could become that still. But I also know it wasn't that long ago that Bobby Wood was viewed as the starting center forward for the national team. And, here he goes to Hamburg, and he's going to be the next big star for the Americans in Germany. And that obviously hasn't happened. So I do think there's a feeling that Sargent has real promise, but could go either way. Well,
Bobby Wood is a story for itself, I guess, because especially now that he's still at Hamburg, and Hamburg, they try to get rid of him basically, and he denies any attempts to leave Hamburg. So that's an interesting thing, of course. I mean, I guess with Sargent, I think there's also the risk that he might, because Werder Bremen, they will probably again battle relegation, and that he will get lost in the shuffle in a sense, because it's kind of tough, as you said, to play for a team like Werder, and also not perform that well and not shine in any sense. So yeah, I guess that there's a risk. And what's your take on Chris Richards? Because I mean, Bayern, they made a couple of last minute signings during the summer transfer window, or was more or less a summer transfer window. It ended in October, but then they signed also Saar at right back, and have a couple of center backs. So there's not really a path for Chris Richards to the first team to get a lot of time there. Do you think he's also someone who should consider at least a loan deal, or maybe leaving Bayern, because there's no way he will break through, especially at 20? So he's getting up there in age, where you want to pick up time on the field instead of sitting on the bench or playing for the reserve team?
I think it's a tough situation for Chris Richards because he has gotten on the field for Bayern's first team. Most of that's been at right back, which is more a reflection of Bayern's needs than what Chris Richards is best at. But I think at this point in his career, he needs to be playing. And based on what we're seeing right now, I'm kind of wishing that he had gone on loan this season to a place where even if it was in the Bundesliga, he could have played more. Because he's a really promising player. He just got called up to the U.S. men's national team for the first time. And, you know, he's shown well for Bayern's reserves, but it's something where I think we're getting to a point where he needs to show that he can, you know, get time in the Bundesliga somewhere and, you know, maybe come back to Bayern later on. But he's a really promising player, really good kid. And I like sort of his mentality. So I think he's still got a very good future.
Yeah, like one of the things I was going to mention is that, you know, our mutual acquaintance Adam Bells did this really good podcast with Chris Richards' dad, and that just, you know, you heard a lot about his background, and I really think that I agree with you. Like I was kind of thinking about Werder Bremen maybe as an option for him to get some playing time, and a team that I think Konstantin and I called the worst 7th or 8th place team. I think they're in 9th now, but like we watched their games, and you know, we followed them, and we're actually kind of somewhat big fans of Florian Kohfeldt, their coach, but it's not pretty to watch. And the other thing with the right back situation is, I mean, you know, Bayern were in for Serginho Dest for a really long time. I mean, that was a big rumor for over the year now. So there could have been another thing to maybe even get that over the line, but obviously didn't happen. The player I want to ask you about, because like I wrote a piece for StatsBomb in February, kind of tying all these players from like it was called No Pulisic, No Problem, and from it kind of examined all these players from like Zach Steffen, who left, and Gio Reyna and Sargent, but Tyler Adams is for me still the enigma, because on one hand, like his game is so refined and so mature, and he just does so many intelligent things, and he's always there when it's pressing. You know, he can play so many positions. But on the other hand, like I always see him hurt. I think now he's got a knee injury, and I was just looking at sort of before the show that he's already had like 8 different injuries in his almost 2 years at Leipzig. So what do you see him, or where do you rate him? Where do you rank him? Like, what do you see sort of his ceiling and his future?
I see the injury situation with Tyler Adams being similar to Christian Pulisic's, where he just is out a lot due to injury. And I know that's really frustrating because I think Tyler Adams' ceiling is very, very high. I've always thought if he can stay healthy, that the way Tyler Adams arrived mid-season a couple years ago in Leipzig and became a starter very quickly and had a really positive influence on that team, I think that he could play at the biggest clubs in the world in a couple years. But he's got to stay healthy. His game, his mentality, they've always been off the charts in terms of just how he approaches covering space, intelligence, soccer IQ. He's not, I guess, a great goal scorer, but that's not often what he's asked. That's not what he's asked to do. So it was funny that he ended up scoring the goal that sent Leipzig to the Champions League semifinals. But I like, if you interview Tyler Adams, you also realize very quickly this guy's going to be the captain of the national team at some point, probably very soon. And you just hope that he stays healthy. I mean, like I'm surprised a little bit that injuries have been such a concern for some of the best young American players. I know it's frustrating for them. I know it's frustrating for the fans.
Yeah, with the injuries thing, that's one of the things that Leipzig has always struggled with. Like now, I think recently they've actually lost a ton of people, just even center back or even central midfield as well. So this would have been actually a great time for Adams to get a lot of playing time. And I second the part about, I mean, your interview with him was fantastic, where he kind of takes you inside the Corona situation, and I actually learned a lot from just kind of what they were going through. I think it was like before a Freiburg game that or after the Freiburg game that you talked to him in right after the break, and he seems to be like a fascinating guy, and I really wish nothing but the best for him. But I'm also like, as you say, like that might be an interesting topic for further discussion of why there's a lot of injuries for these players. But it could just be also that the schedule is just so congested, and there's just injuries everywhere, and it might not have to do with Americans at all. And I guess the last person we want to talk about is Gio Reyna. I know you also had a great interview with him where he talks so much about how I think he needs to learn how to cook, and that seemed to be a more difficult problem than like unlocking a Champions League side. And I really that's one of the reasons why your podcast was so good, because you get to see sort of the human side of these people. And I think just coming back to the earlier point about Freddie Adu is maybe, the landscape of the media is different, and we get to see these people as people and teenagers and people who are adjusting to new things in a new country, and we maybe can appreciate that more. And I think it's kind of our job as media to show that side of it, and not just kind of always ask from them something that they can just that they just have to fulfill, and kind of, some people living vicariously through these youngsters. So I thought that was a really good interview that you did with Reyna. But what do you see with him? I mean, why is he so beloved by Lucien Favre, and why is he held in such a high regard? I mean, by everybody. And how do you see him as a player?
You look at Reyna, and it's interesting. He's kind of a mix in playing styles of his two parents, who both played for the U.S. national men's and women's teams. Claudio Reyna obviously played in 3 World Cups. And, like Gio's a slightly different player than his dad, but he has, he's farther up the field. He's more involved in scoring goals. He's literally taller and bigger than his dad, and has probably more athleticism, is I think a fair way to put it. But his mom was a winger with a ton of speed, and she had actually more probably athleticism in a raw sense, and created more goals, and Gio's got that in him too. But like in the podcast interview that he and I had, it was clear to me when I was just talking to him about the game, he sounded like his dad in analyzing the game, which is just, very smart, very aware of everything happening on the field, not just in relation to him. And he didn't sound like a 17-year-old at all. And so I think I can imagine that that's part of the impression that he has made on the Dortmund coaching staff as well, is just his ability to be coached, to learn new things, to see the game well, is way beyond his years. And that's really exciting. And it makes me glad that he matched up with Dortmund, a club that has done so well over the years at developing young players and giving them opportunities to play. So I'm just extremely excited about Gio Reyna, and who knows if he's going to be at Dortmund for 1, 2, or 5 more years. I mean, the way these things tend to go when you are a starter at age 17 for Dortmund, you typically don't stay there that long. But for like, there's just a lot of excitement right now in American soccer circles that you've got guys like Pulisic, who seems old, but he's 22. And Reyna, who's 17, and these guys are at really top Champions League clubs and very involved in scoring goals and creating goals. So we haven't really seen that in the past at that level with American players.
Sorry, maybe like different type of players, because I mean, even the ones that we were talking about before, they tend to be more sort of defensive minded, or like the fullback, center back, maybe occasional guy who will have like a flash in the pan season, and then you'll have sort of some of the more sort of cerebral or even like industrial kind of industrious midfielders. And now we're seeing this new player who, like in my conversations with some of the Dortmund staff who work with them, I mean, that they always kind of bring this mentality and coachability out, and that was obviously clearly the big point of Pulisic, and it seems like the one with Reyna. So, and that's also maybe an added bonus of why these American players are having success in Germany, because they just seem to be very coachable, and they are highly intelligent at a young age, and they are thinking about the game deeply, and they want to learn, and they want to put in the work every day, which might not be the case with with some of the other players, which I think if you are following like Dortmund closely, or even some of the other teams in Leipzig, like you will see some examples of people who might not bring it every day, might not have that work ethic. But the thing I wanted to ask you, Grant, is maybe beyond those guys. I mean, I know you've already mentioned a ton of people, and you there's obviously a huge USMNT revival. Is there like some other players that we are missing, or maybe sort of a second wave that we are not hearing about so much, or in terms of players?
I mean, we mentioned Caden Clark. It's funny, there's a similarly named guy named Cade Cowell out with San Jose Earthquakes, who's just gotten off to a very good start to his career. We're seeing MLS giving playing opportunities to a lot of young American teenagers. And so I do think that will be part of the next wave, and at least gives an indication that maybe this isn't necessarily just a golden generation we're seeing right now at these top clubs in Europe, that maybe this is what it's going to be like moving forward for the United States. And that's what you need to do if you actually want as a country to move from the middle tier to the top tier. And that does take time, obviously. And we're in the 25th year of MLS. So maybe that's finally starting to happen.
Yeah, and I think maybe the mindset behind using or giving playing time to some of these teenagers, also that now the MLS clubs have realized that you have these players only for a little while before they might move on to Europe, and maybe you want to capitalize on them. What I wanted to ask you, or we wanted to shift to one other topic, because I think the narrative about Americans in Europe, in Germany right now, not only about Gio Reyna and Christian Pulisic and Weston McKennie, of course they are the stars on the field, but also we have quote unquote stars, maybe, I don't know if they are stars, but we have the people on the sidelines. And in Germany with Pellegrino, Matarazzo, for instance, now someone who came up with Stuttgart, was promoted to the Bundesliga, and was also now recognized as one of the bright minds of the coaching game. So I think there's also not a wave maybe, but there's also now coaches from the States who are making a name for themselves in the Bundesliga, and we might also talk about someone who's making a name for himself in Austria, which is also usually closely connected to Germany. You interviewed, you talked to Matarazzo for your show. I mean, he's an interesting guy, I think, in terms of like what he does tactically and how he's managing the team. But what is your feeling? What is he in terms of his personality? What kind of personality is he? Because I think he hasn't shown his personality so much, I think, in Germany, at least to the mainstream media, maybe to local media, yes. But I think he's a pretty interesting guy. So I wanted to hear your experience, your take on Pellegrino.
Yeah, I really enjoyed interviewing Matarazzo on my podcast because I had not spoken to him before that. And he has spent a lot of years in Germany, and to the point where he even said that a fair number of Germans don't even really think he's American. And I don't know if that's something he takes as a compliment. He obviously still has a family and family members in New Jersey, where he's from, and has a pretty deep connection there. But it's definitely a different situation than with Jesse Marsch, because we saw Jesse Marsch play in MLS and then coach in MLS. And it's only recently, in the last couple of years, that Jesse Marsch went to Leipzig as an assistant and then to be the head coach at Salzburg and now be coaching in the Champions League. But Jesse Marsch has been part of this culture over in North America for a long time. So I think if in a media sense, we knew more about him. And Matarazzo's story is just getting told for the first time. But it's a fascinating story. And it like Marsch and Matarazzo show that there's different ways for Americans to go about getting to this level in coaching. But there's still very few coaches, American coaches, that have done this, far fewer than we've seen with players. And so they're almost more pioneers even now than the players are. And it's clear that Matarazzo, built a relationship with Julian Nagelsmann that has been very productive, and helped Matarazzo advance in his career and get the opportunity to go to Stuttgart and do what he's done. But I still think his story is sort of undercovered in the U.S. media, just because this is a recent development, him getting to the Bundesliga, and he hasn't actually, coached or played in the U.S.
Yeah, I agree with you, because when I was listening to that episode that you did, and it was, I known a little bit about him, but that's when kind of I started researching and then found some of the similarities of New Jersey and family there, but also you also couldn't really find anything else on him, certainly not in English, and even in German it was kind of tough. And then people were wondering, is he Italian? What is he? And he's
is he actually a character from The Sopranos?
Yeah, right. He could be, right. It's such a great name, and wonderful team. I think Konstantin and I have kind of adopted Stuttgart as one of our teams for this season. But the person I do want to ask you about more is Jesse Marsch, and just sort of a quick question about he's been linked again. It's not the first time that he's linked with Dortmund, and with the expiring contract of Lucien Favre, that it seems like it would take some kind of a minor miracle to be renewed. Would you think he's ready and the right fit for a club like Dortmund? He has, it's now his second Champions League season with Salzburg, and they are certainly, after the back of last season with Haaland, now, they played a super exciting group stage, and now they're three games through, and they've already played this another couple of these really good games with Bayern. But with that, you think, is that a right fit for Dortmund? How do you see Jesse Marsch?
What's fascinating to me is, I haven't talked to Jesse about the future and where he sees things going. He obviously wants to go as far as a coach in European soccer as he can. And, has Red Bull said anything to him about potentially coaching Leipzig at some point, post Nagelsmann? Because everyone sort of assumes that Nagelsmann will move to an even bigger club before too long, but maybe not this year or next. So I think that's a big question, because Jesse's been in the Red Bull system now for quite a while, when you add up the years in New York and Leipzig and now Salzburg. And that's something where he feels comfortable, and they value him. So I don't know if Red Bull necessarily will just sort of sit by if it looks like Dortmund is going to take Jesse Marsch. I agree with sort of your read on the Favre situation, because it doesn't look like an extension is going to happen there. And maybe it could if Dortmund wins the Bundesliga or something, but it doesn't seem like they are rushing to try and extend that contract. And so I think it's a great sign for Jesse Marsch if he's even listed among the candidates to be the next Dortmund manager. But and we'll see. You know, I know Jesse really well. I went to college with him. I've known him since the 90s. And I think he's been very smart about how he made a lateral move. Maybe even some people thought it wasn't lateral to go from a head coach with Red Bull New York to an assistant coach with Leipzig. But that was a good experience for him, and learning German and being exposed to the crown jewel of the Red Bull system, and then getting this opportunity at Salzburg. I think he's probably frustrated that Salzburg has led in each of these 3 Champions League games this season and has just 1 point. But then again, they led in games against Atletico Madrid and Bayern Munich. And they showed pretty well last year against Liverpool and Napoli. So I think people in Europe at big clubs are aware of Jesse Marsch, and I think he's an attractive candidate. And so I think for him to put himself in that situation in a fairly short time is really impressive.
So you mentioned that, especially Jesse Marsch, because he has more of an typical career coming over from the United States to Europe and now managing a European team, as opposed to maybe Matarazzo, who's kind of a unique career. But you mentioned that these guys are pioneers in a way, and I totally agree. I mean, there are several reasons for that. There are small number of coaching jobs at the professional level in Europe. And also I think sometimes there's still the feeling that, like, I think in Germany to a lesser extent, but in some countries that like domestic coaches or the people from the domestic system should get the coaching jobs because it's about the, educating the players in a certain kind of way and reproducing what the respective FA maybe puts out there in terms of philosophy and tactics and so on. So maybe there's kind of that still some of that mindset, but I think not so much in Germany, but in some countries maybe. But coming to the point of these guys are pioneers, and you follow your soccer so much. So are there any other coaches you see who have the potential, who could come over and take over a club like Salzburg, like Leipzig, like Leverkusen, and have a similar career like Marsch? Are there any other coaches who have the potential to do that?
I look at Caleb Porter. He's in Columbus now, but he won a championship with Portland in MLS, as somebody who is capable of doing that. I don't know if he aspires to do that. His age is probably around what Jesse Marsch's age is right now. So if he is going to go to Europe, that would need to happen fairly soon. Jesse Marsch got into a really good situation with Red Bull because obviously Red Bull had teams in Europe, and there was an established pathway there for him to go to. We don't really see anyone with that Jesse Marsch-like profile in Red Bull in New York right now. So I down the line, I could see potentially that happening again, but we aren't seeing it right now. You look around and there's not a lot of really young MLS head coaches right now. So, and the ones that are having success that are younger, like Greg Vanney in Toronto, don't seem to appear to want to go to Europe. And that's a little tough because, like, if you have a lot of success in MLS, you can get paid pretty well and you're winning. And your best option, if you're going to go to Europe at that point, is probably going to be a tougher situation. potentially, especially if you try and go over as a head coach. And if you want to go over as an assistant coach, like Jesse Marsch did, that might be tough for some head coaches. So I think that's all part of it.
Yeah, it kind of reminded me of when you were talking about this, of like being the like best Real Madrid or Barcelona basketball player and then like making the leap to the NBA. And it's like, maybe it's not in your best interest financially and whatnot. And would you want to be the ninth guy or something? And yeah, but I also think that maybe that could be something that these coaches do. And I agree with you on maybe there's the stigma is probably too strong of a word, but there are certain stereotypes that I think still exist, and not just to U.S. coaches, but even some players that hopefully this generation of coaches and U.S. players can slowly dispel and do away with, and I think that's in the interest of everybody, just so that we can move forward. And sort of the final parting question, which I know you watch a lot of Bundesliga because clearly you're doing a lot of these interviews and you are following it closely. Has that translated? I mean, I know there's obviously a new TV deal with ESPN. Has that, like, from where you can see, has that translated into an increased viewership, or where does sort of the Bundesliga rank right now in sort of US TV market, or even just popular culture? Or how do you see that?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting now because you have this move toward soccer games being broadcast in the United States much less often now on cable television and much more often on pay streaming services. And so we don't always see the numbers for how many people are viewing Bundesliga games, for example, because ESPN Plus is a pay streaming service and almost all of the Bundesliga is on that now. So when the Bundesliga was on Fox, it was on Fox cable channels, and we were able to get weekly numbers on each game. I think it's possible that we could see the Bundesliga grow in popularity and the broadcast grow in popularity because, for one thing, the English Premier League has gotten to be more difficult to watch on American television, and that's connected to what NBC is doing with their streaming service and pay tier. And they made it harder to watch. Like, the biggest game of the Premier League this weekend is Man City Liverpool, and it's on their top pay tier. And I don't think nearly as many people are going to see it as they would have last season. So I think that's creating an opportunity for the Bundesliga, which is on ESPN Plus, which is more people have it. Yeah. And you also have more young Americans playing for Bundesliga teams. And I think that could be a real positive for the Bundesliga, but we'll see. I wish we had more in the way of numbers right now, because I think in general, the more you're on pay streaming services, the harder it is to create new fans. And I still think this is an immature soccer market in the United States, and we could create millions more fans, but it becomes harder then if you're putting up more barriers for them to actually watch games.
I mean, for now, I guess it will take another couple of years, and maybe when the television market changes again, because I guess that's an ever-changing market in a way, especially when it comes to platforms and these different models. Maybe that will again change, because I think from a European perspective, or from a Bundesliga perspective, you had the feeling that not in terms of numbers maybe, but you had the feeling that the attention was growing. But I guess that was also to do with that media was maybe reporting more intensely about some of the stuff that happened in the Bundesliga, but that had to do with Pulisic, McKennie, and Reyna and others, I guess. So there was maybe a false perception there. But it's, of course, as you said, it's it might change again. We will see. It's really hard to judge, I guess. But it's at least exciting in terms of the talent that's in the Bundesliga right now, and that's, I mean, American talent that's all across Europe. because there is a kind of a golden generation, the feeling that there is a great also national team that's developing right now in front of our eyes, and with some of these guys really, really young, especially Gio Reyna, and also Pulisic. Even it feels like he has been around for so long already. So I guess that's really exciting. And I guess also from European perspective or from a German perspective, a lot of people wish that the American market would grow and mature, and also to have these American talents, because they also bring a lot of energy often enough. Yeah, I guess that was something, especially Dortmund like about Gio Reyna, for instance, that he even at 17, 18, he's already, he brings a lot of energy and a positive energy. And that's something that can help also and be exciting for the game itself, but also for everything that is connected to the game. So Grant, we want to thank you for all your insight into US soccer, US football. It was great talking to you. Thanks for your time.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I've really enjoyed the conversation.
Great. Also to our listeners, please check out Futból with Grant Wahl, your podcast, with a lot of great interviews with people, with journalists, but also with players, coaches. So you can listen to a lot of great people, and you're interviewing them, and you're really bringing something that I think still media misses in the sense that they can show their personality, and I think that's exciting. And when you can listen to Gio Reyna and really showing his personality, or Jurgen Klopp, for instance, there was also a great listener in my opinion. So that's also a podcast you should, if you haven't, you should subscribe to Grant's podcast. He is at Grant Wahl on Twitter. Abe is at BundesPL on Twitter. I am CC_Eckner on Twitter. If you want to support us, please visit patreon.com/thefutbolpod. And for now, we are out.